Blood was trickling down my shoulder as I stared at the door Jessica had just slammed shut, and for the first time I felt afraid of my own daughter. The echo of that push still reverberated in my bones, but it wasn't the physical pain that cut me deep inside. It was the certainty that I had created a monster that had now turned against me. My breathing was irregular, and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth reminded me that this wasn't just another family argument. Jessica had crossed a line I never thought she would be capable of crossing, and now I was alone in my own home, wounded and betrayed by the person I loved most in this world. The bills scattered across the coffee table seemed to mock me. All those credit card statements she had accumulated, all those loans I had taken out in her name, everything was there as evidence of my own naivety. The silence of the house weighed on me like a tombstone, broken only by the sound of my own contained crying. I knew my life had changed forever in those few minutes of fury, but I still didn't fully understand the abyss that was opening before me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. My name is Walter Johnson, and I never imagined that at 68 years old I would be counting every penny of my retirement as if my life depended on it. And maybe it really did. My home office smelled of stale coffee and aged paper, while I organized for the third time that month the bank statements that showed an increasingly frightening reality. My retired accountant's pension covered the basic necessities, but Jessica seemed not to understand that at 28 years old, it was time to take on her own financial responsibilities. The familiar sound of her key in the lock made me sigh deeply. Once again, she was arriving unannounced, probably with another story about money she needed to borrow. The yellowish light from my office lamp created shadows that danced on the walls, as if even they knew something bad was about to happen. I carefully put the papers away in the drawer, knowing that soon I would need to defend them, like a soldier protecting his last cartridge. The sound of her hurried footsteps on the stairs told me that this time would be different. There was urgency in each step, a determination that made my stomach churn with anxiety. "Dad, we need to talk." Jessica's voice echoed through the house with a firmness I didn't recognize, loaded with an authority she had never demonstrated before. I went down the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight like a harbinger of the difficult moments that were to come. Jessica was standing in the living room, still wearing the wrinkled uniform from the restaurant where she worked part-time, her red eyes revealing poorly slept nights and worries she'd learned to carry alone in recent months. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and there was a sauce stain on her blouse that she hadn't even noticed. Details that strangely made me feel a wave of paternal protection, even knowing she was coming to demand something from me. My hands trembled slightly when I leaned on the handrail. Age was beginning to take its toll, and moments of tension like that made my joints ache more than normal. "My rent is 3 months behind," she said without beating around the bush, and her brutal honesty caught me off guard. Usually she started with elaborate excuses and promises of future payment. "If I don't pay $1,200 by Friday, I'm going to be evicted, and I have nowhere else to go." The silence that followed was filled only by the tick-tock of the clock on the wall, marking each second of tension that accumulated between us like storm clouds. I felt my heart race as I did the math mentally. $1,200 represented almost my entire monthly pension, and I still had my own bills to pay, including blood pressure medications that cost a fortune. "Jessica, you know I love you more than anything in this world, but I simply don't have that money available." The words came out with difficulty, each one weighing like lead on my conscience as a father. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of desperation and something darker that I couldn't completely identify. The air in the room seemed to have gotten thicker, charged with a dangerous electricity that made the hair on my arm stand up like when a storm approaches. But you have the house, you have investments, you have Mom's retirement money, she insisted, and her voice began to rise in tone in a way that made me instinctively step back. The mention of my late wife brought a familiar pain to my chest. Margaret had left a $50,000 life insurance policy, but that money was reserved for real emergencies, not to cover a grown daughter's financial mistakes. "That money isn't meant to be spent like that, Jessica," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm while my mind quickly calculated all the times I had already loaned money to her over the past 5 years. It was at least $15,000 in loans that were never repaid, money that had come from the savings that Margaret and I had built together during 40 years of marriage. The expression on Jessica's face changed, as if someone had flipped a switch, and for the first time I saw something in her that made me question whether I really knew my own daughter. "You always talk about Mum as if she were more important than me," she said with a bitterness that cut my heart like a sharp blade. The smell of the cheap perfume she wore mixed with the frying aroma coming from her work clothes, creating a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. "But she's been dead for 10 years, Dad, and I'm here, alive, needing your help, and you're more worried about money than about your own daughter." Her words echoed through the walls like shots, and I felt each one of them embed deep in my soul, because part of me knew she wasn't completely wrong. At 68 years old, I had learned that the deepest wounds always come from the people we love most. The temperature in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees when Jessica began pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her heavy steps making the wooden floor groan under her feet. "You don't understand, Jessica," I tried to explain, extending my hands in a gesture of peace that she completely ignored. "If I keep giving you money every time you ask, you'll never learn to manage on your own." The words came out harsher than I intended, and I saw her eyes narrow like those of a predator that had just identified its prey. The air conditioning had stopped working a week ago, and the Ohio summer heat made the atmosphere even more unbearable, making sweat run down my forehead while I tried to maintain composure. "So that's it?" she screamed, and her emotion-cracked voice made the neighbors turn on their lights. I could see the curtains moving in the windows next door. "You're going to let me become a beggar on the street while you sit there on your money like a miser?" The word miser hit me like a punch in the stomach, because I knew Margaret would never have let me get to this point. She always found a way to help Jessica without compromising our future. Now, alone and aging, every decision seemed to carry the weight of a death sentence. I felt my legs wobble when Jessica approached me, her eyes shining with a fury I had never witnessed in all my life as a father. "I worked 40 years to have some security in my old age," I said, my voice coming out weaker than I would have liked. "I can't just throw all that away." The sound of her heavy breathing seemed to fill the entire space of the room, and I realized that my own hands were shaking. I didn't know if from fear, anger, or simply the high blood pressure that the doctor always warned me to control. "Security?" Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. It was the laughter of someone who had completely lost their sanity. "What security, Dad? You're going to die alone in this house because you're more worried about numbers in the bank than about the people you love." Her words echoed through the house like a curse, and I felt something break inside my chest. Maybe it was my heart. Maybe it was simply the last hope that I could still save the relationship with my daughter. The smell of mold coming from the basement mixed with the sweet aroma of her makeup, creating a nauseating combination that made me want to vomit. I knew I was witnessing the moment when I would lose Jessica forever, but I had no idea I was about to discover how far my own daughter would be capable of going to get what she wanted. "Jessica, please, let's talk calmly," I begged, extending my trembling hand toward her. But it was like trying to calm a storm with whispered words. She looked at my extended hand with the same contempt one looks at a disgusting insect, and at that moment I knew I had completely lost control of the situation. "Talk calmly," she repeated, her voice rising an octave and gaining a hysterical tone that made me step back further. "I came here begging for your help, Dad, and you're here giving me moral lessons about financial responsibility." The sweat running down my back wasn't just from the heat. It was the cold sweat of fear, of recognizing that I had created something that was now beyond my control. The room lights seemed to flicker, or maybe it was my eyes that were failing under the pressure of the moment, but everything seemed to be moving in slow motion, like in the movies I used to watch with Margaret. "You know what I think?" Jessica said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was much scarier than the screaming. "I think you never really loved me. You only love Mom's memory and that dirty money of hers." My world stopped spinning when Jessica raised her hand and pointed her finger at my face like a loaded weapon. But it would be what happened next that would change our lives forever. What happened in the next few seconds forever changed the way I see my own daughter and made me question every decision I made as a father over nearly 3 decades. Jessica didn't just point her finger at me. She lunged forward with a force I didn't know existed in that frail body, pushing my chest with both open hands as if I were an obstacle in her path. The impact caught me completely off guard, and I felt my feet lose balance on the living room rug that Margaret had bought on our honeymoon. My 68-year-old body no longer had the stability it once had, and I fell backward like a rag doll, hitting my right shoulder on the corner of the coffee table with a crack that echoed throughout the house. The pain was instantaneous and sharp, radiating through my arm like liquid fire. But worse than the physical pain was the shock of realizing that my own daughter had assaulted me. The taste of blood filled my mouth when I bit my tongue in the fall, and for a moment everything went silent. Even Jessica seemed to have been paralyzed by what she had just done. The smell of my own sweat, mixed with the floral aroma of the fabric softener I used on clothes, created a surreal atmosphere, as if I were living a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. "My God, Dad, Jessica began to speak, but her voice died mid-sentence when she saw the blood trickling from my nose, where I had hit when falling. For a few precious seconds, I saw a glimpse of the sweet girl she had once been, that 7-year-old child who cried when she accidentally stepped on an ant in the garden. But that moment of humanity lasted less than a blink of an eye, because soon the mask of anger returned to her face, more intense than before. "You deserved it," she said, and her voice had gained a coldness that made me tremble more than the pain in my shoulder. "Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to be helpless and have nowhere to go." I tried to get up using my left arm, but the pain in my right shoulder was so intense that I could barely move without groaning. The blood trickling from my nose dripped onto the wooden floor, creating small, dark puddles that seemed to mark the end of an era in my life. Jessica remained standing before me, looking down like a judge contemplating a condemned criminal. And for the first time in my life, I felt genuine fear of the person I had created. The silence was broken only by the sound of my labored breathing and the relentless tick-tock of the clock on the wall, marking the seconds that separated the before and after of our relationship. "You can't just hit me and think that's going to solve anything," I managed to say through clenched teeth, trying to maintain a minimum of dignity even while lying on my own living room floor. Each word I spoke made my mouth hurt more, but I needed to try to reach some vestige of reason that might still exist within my daughter. "Jessica, this is domestic violence. You could go to jail for this," I continued, and immediately regretted the words when I saw her eyes narrow even more. The threat seemed to awaken something even more dangerous inside her, as if I had just challenged a wild animal to a fight. "Jail," she laughed, but it was a hollow sound, empty of any joy or humor. It was the laughter of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Who's going to believe that a little girl weighing 110 pounds assaulted a grown man? You're just too weak to handle a little push. The sarcasm in her voice cut deeper than any physical wound, because I knew she was right. Who would really believe that my own daughter had attacked me over money? The air in the room seemed to be getting thinner every second, and I felt as if I was suffocating in my own home. My vision began to blur. I don't know if from pain or emotional shock at discovering I had raised a monster. Finally, I managed to lean against the wall and stand up, but the movement sent a wave of nausea through my body, like a poisonous tide. Jessica continued staring at me with those cold eyes I didn't recognize, and I realized she was waiting for me to give in, for me to run to the safe and bring the money she wanted, like a trained dog fetching the newspaper. "I'm not going to give you that money, Jessica," I managed to say with more firmness than I felt, and each word seemed to cost years of my life. "Not after what you just did." The expression on her face changed again, this time to something I can only describe as sadistic satisfaction, as if she had just confirmed some dark theory about my personality. "So you chose money over me," she said, shaking her head with an expression of false sadness. "Mom would be so proud to see what kind of man you really are." The mention of Margaret was like a dagger in my already wounded heart, because I knew my wife would never have let the situation get to this point. She always found a way to calm Jessica, to make her see reason without direct confrontations, but Margaret was no longer here, and I was alone facing the creature our daughter had become. The metallic smell of my own blood mixed with her sickening perfume, creating an atmosphere of violence that seemed to have permanently settled in my house. "You don't know your mother like you think you do," I replied, wiping the blood from my nose with the back of my left hand, since my right still hung useless at my side. "Margaret would never have approved of what you've become, a person who assaults her own father for money." The words came out harsher than I intended, loaded with all the pain and disappointment I had been swallowing for years. Jessica recoiled as if I had just slapped her, and for a moment I saw tears forming in her eyes, but they were soon replaced by an even more intense rage. "How dare you talk about Mom to me?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house walls like a war cry. "You who let her die alone in that hospital while you were worried about your spreadsheets and bills." The accusation hit me like a bullet to the chest because there was a portion of truth in it that I spent every day trying to forget. Margaret had spent her last conscious moments asking me to take care of Jessica, and maybe I had failed miserably in that promise by raising a daughter who thought she could get everything through violence and emotional manipulation. The sound of cars passing on the street seemed distant and unreal, as if I were living in a nightmare bubble from which I couldn't escape. I felt my left knee begin to tremble, a combination of age, shock, and adrenaline running through my veins like poison. "Your mother asked me to take care of you, not to give you everything you wanted without question," I managed to reply, leaning more firmly against the wall because I felt I could fall again at any moment. The pain in my shoulder had transformed into a constant throbbing that went up to my neck and down my arm, making my fingers tingle in a worrying way. Taking care means teaching responsibility, not being an ATM with legs. Jessica took a few steps in my direction, and instinctively I shrank against the wall, hating myself for showing fear in front of the person I had created and loved unconditionally for 28 years. "Responsibility," she repeated, her voice distilling pure venom. "What responsibility did you teach me, Dad? The only thing you taught me was that money is more important than family, that numbers in a bank account are worth more than your own daughter's well-being." Each word she uttered seemed calculated to cause maximum possible emotional damage, and I realized I was dealing with someone who knew exactly where I was hurt, and knew how to twist the knife in the wound. The broken air conditioning made sweat run down my face, mixing with the blood that still occasionally dripped from my nose. I knew I needed to make a decision at that moment. Either I gave in to her emotional and physical blackmail, or I finally set a limit that could cost our relationship forever. "Get out of my house!" The words came out of my mouth before I even realized I had made a decision. The silence that followed was so deep that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the distant sound of a lawnmower in the neighbor's yard. Jessica looked at me as if I had just grown a second head, clearly not expecting me to have the courage to kick her out of the house after everything that had happened. "What?" she asked, and for the first time since she had arrived, her voice showed a crack of uncertainty. "You heard me perfectly," I repeated, finding a strength I didn't know I still possessed at 68 years old. "Get out of my house now, and don't come back until you're ready to apologize and talk like a civilized human being, not like a wild animal." The words echoed through the room with an authority I hadn't exercised in years, and I saw Jessica step back, finally realizing she had gone too far. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a few seconds she looked like the scared child who used to hide behind my legs when she was afraid of storms. But that moment of vulnerability lasted only a few seconds before the mask of anger returned to her face, more intense and dangerous than before. "You're going to regret this, Dad," she said, her voice low and loaded with a sinister promise that made my skin crawl. "When I'm living on the street, when something terrible happens to me, you'll remember this moment and know it was your fault." But not all the threats in the world could have prepared me for the sound of the door slamming and the screams she made sure all the neighbors heard. "My own father kicked me out of the house. He prefers money to his own daughter." The silence that followed after the door slammed was more deafening than any scream Jessica could have given, and it was in that absolute void that I finally understood the magnitude of what had happened in my living room. My shoulder throbbed with a pain that seemed to have a life of its own, radiating waves of agony that went up to my neck and down my right arm like liquid fire running through my veins. I tried to move my arm, and an involuntary groan escaped my lips. There was definitely something wrong, very wrong, and I knew I needed urgent medical attention. The blood from my nose had stopped flowing, but had left a red trail on my white shirt that looked like crime evidence, tangible proof that my own daughter had physically assaulted me in my own home. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the aroma of fear I couldn't hide, an acrid odor of cold sweat that emanated from my pores, as if my body were trying to expel the trauma I had just experienced. I walked to the hallway mirror with trembling steps, and the reflection that faced me was of a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. My eyes were bloodshot, my grey hair was disheveled, and there was an expression of shock and despair stamped on my face that I had never seen before. The next 2 hours passed like a slow-motion movie, each movement causing waves of pain that constantly reminded me of what Jessica had done to me. I managed to drive to the emergency room at Cleveland General Hospital with my left arm, keeping my right immobile against my chest like a wounded bird I was trying to protect. The reception nurse, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a maternal smile, looked at me with the expression of someone who had seen many cases of domestic violence over the years. "Mr. Johnson, what happened to you?" she asked while filling out the admission form, her voice loaded with professional concern that made me feel simultaneously grateful and ashamed. "I fell," I lied without hesitation, the words coming out automatically as if my brain had decided on its own to protect Jessica from the consequences of her actions. I tripped on the living room rug and hit my shoulder on the table. And the lie came out with frightening naturalness, but I saw in the nurse's eyes that she wasn't completely convinced. There was something in my expression, in the way I avoided her gaze, that said there was more to the story than I was telling. The hospital smell of disinfectant and medications brought me painful memories of Margaret's last days, when I spent hours sitting beside her bed, watching her slowly waste away, as cancer consumed her body day after day. Dr. Rodriguez, a Hispanic man in his 40s with gentle hands and penetrating gaze, examined my shoulder with the care of someone who truly cares about patients' well-being. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to be direct with you," he said, after analyzing the X-rays that showed a fracture in the humerus and inflamed tissues around the joint. This injury isn't consistent with a simple fall. The angle of the fracture and the bruises on your chest suggest that you were pushed with considerable force. I felt my heart race when I realized he was questioning my version of the facts, but I maintained a neutral expression, even feeling cold sweat run down my back. "Doctor, I assure you it was just a fall," I insisted, hating every word of the lie that came out of my mouth, but unable to admit the humiliating truth that my daughter had assaulted me over money. The doctor looked at me for a few seconds that seemed eternal, his dark eyes analyzing not only my physical injuries, but also the emotional signs I was desperately trying to hide. "Mr. Johnson, I've worked at this hospital for 15 years, and I've seen many cases of domestic violence," he said gently but firmly. "If you're going through any situation of abuse, there are resources available to help you. You don't have to face this alone." And the word abuse echoed in my mind like a funeral bell, forcing me to confront a reality I wasn't prepared to accept. My own daughter had become my aggressor. The process of immobilizing my arm in a sling and receiving instructions about post-fracture care passed like a confused blur of professional voices and medical procedures that my traumatized mind could barely process. "You'll need to do physical therapy in 6 weeks, Doctor," Rodriguez explained while adjusting the sling around my neck, "and it's fundamental that you keep your arm immobilized during this period to avoid complications." I paid the hospital bill, $340 that came directly from the savings account Margaret and I had built together, and felt a bitter irony realizing I was spending our hard-earned money to treat wounds caused by the person who wanted to waste the rest of that same savings. The drive home was physical and emotional torture. Every curve in the road made my shoulder protest with pain, and every red light gave me more time to think about the expression of pure hatred I had seen in Jessica's eyes when she pushed me. The Ohio sun had set while I was at the hospital, and now I was driving through the familiar streets of my neighborhood under the weak light of the street lamps, feeling like a stranger in my own life. When I finally got home, the blinking light on the answering machine informed me that there were messages waiting, and my heart tightened, thinking that maybe Jessica had called to apologize. But the first message wasn't from Jessica. It was from my neighbor Mike, a Ford retiree who had become my closest friend since Margaret's death. "Walter, buddy, I heard some screaming at your house this afternoon." His recorded voice sounded worried and slightly embarrassed. "Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. If you need anything, just knock on the door." The second message was from my sister Nancy, who lived in Columbus, and religiously called every Monday to see how I was doing. "Hi, Walter. Just calling for our weekly chat. Call me back when you can. I want to know how you and Jessica are getting along." The sound of her own voice mentioning Jessica was like a slap in the face, reminding me that now I would have to invent excuses and lies for the whole family about why my daughter was no longer speaking to me. The third message was from a number I didn't recognize, but when the voice started speaking, my blood froze in my veins. It was Jessica, but a Jessica I had never heard before. Her voice was intoxicated, slurred, loaded with a toxic bitterness that made me question if I really knew her. "Dad, I hope you're happy," she said, and I could hear loud music and male voices in the background. She was at some bar or party, probably spending the last pennies she had on alcohol. "I hope your precious $15,000 keep you warm at night because you just lost your daughter forever." The fourth message made my world collapse completely. It was Jessica again, but this time she was sobbing between words, her voice broken with pain and alcohol, creating a symphony of despair that pierced my heart like 1,000 knives. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I don't have anyone else. All my friends abandoned me. The landlord already called, saying he's going to call the police if I don't leave by tomorrow. I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice broke completely, and all I could hear were desperate sobs mixed with traffic noise. She was calling from the street, probably from a payphone, already homeless and hopeless. "I know I was terrible to you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But Dad, you're all I have. If you don't help me, I don't know if I can continue." D. The call was cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the busy signal echoing through my empty living room like the tolling of bells in an abandoned church. I sat in Margaret's armchair for almost an hour, holding the phone with my good hand, while trying to process the storm of emotions that devastated my mind like an uncontrolled hurricane. And it was at that moment I realized I might have just lost my daughter forever. But I still didn't know if this was a tragedy or a liberation. I spent the entire night awake, holding that phone as if it were an anchor preventing me from sinking into the ocean of guilt and regret that threatened to swallow me completely. My mind couldn't stop replaying every word of Jessica's last message, every desperate sob echoing in my conscience like an emergency siren that never stopped ringing. At 3 a.m, I finally went up to the room that had once been hers, where I still kept photos of the sweet girl she had been before life, and my own failures as a father transformed her into the desperate woman who had attacked me hours before. The moonlight entered through the pink curtains Margaret had chosen when Jessica was 8 years old, creating dancing shadows on the walls, where diplomas from high school and graduation photos still hung, seeming to belong to a completely different life. I opened the drawer of her study table and found piles of collection letters she had left there years ago. Credit card bills, student loans, car financing she had lost for lack of payment. A trail of financial irresponsibility I had ignored for years out of pure, blind, paternal love. Each document I leafed through revealed a destructive pattern that had been repeating for more than 5 years. She borrowed money, promised to pay, failed with the promises, and then came crying on my shoulder, asking me to save her one more time. The bills totaled more than $25,000 in accumulated debts, an amount that represented half of Margaret's life insurance, and for the first time I realized I wasn't helping my daughter. I was financing her self-destruction. The musty smell coming from the old clothes in the wardrobe mixed with the familiar aroma of her perfume that still permeated the pillows, creating a ghostly atmosphere that made me feel as if I were visiting someone's grave who had died long ago. When the sun began to rise through the curtains, painting the room with golden tones that reminded me of the happy Sundays when Jessica was little and Margaret was still alive, I made a decision I knew would change my life forever. I went down to the office and called Dr. Linda Thompson, a psychologist specializing in family therapy I had met years before when Margaret was undergoing chemotherapy, and we needed emotional support. "Dr. Thompson, this is Walter Johnson," I said, when she answered the phone with her calm and professional voice that always reassured me. "I remember you, Mr. Johnson. How can I help you today?" I told the whole story, without omitting any detail. The years of unpaid loans, the escalation of manipulative behavior, the physical aggression the night before, the desperate messages on my answering machine. My voice failed several times during the account, especially when I described the moment Jessica pushed me and the expression of hatred I saw in her eyes when she realized I wouldn't give in to emotional blackmail. "Mr. Johnson, Doctor," Thompson said after I finished my painful confession, "what you're describing is a classic pattern of financial codependency aggravated by manipulative and lately violent behavior. Your daughter has developed an unrealistic expectation that you will always save her from the consequences of her own choices, and when that didn't happen, she resorted to violence as a last resort of control." Her words were like a painful but necessary revelation, forcing me to confront the reality that my paternal love had transformed into something toxic that was harming both Jessica and myself. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice coming out more fragile than I would like to admit. "The first thing you need to understand, Dr. Thompson explained, with the patience of someone who had already seen hundreds of similar cases, is that continuing to give money to Jessica at this point would be the equivalent of giving drugs to an addict. It might relieve the suffering temporarily, but perpetuates the destructive cycle and prevents her from developing the necessary skills to solve her own problems." Her words were like bitter medicine I knew I needed to swallow, even though each gulp was painful, like ground glass going down my throat. We scheduled an appointment for that same afternoon, and when I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief for finally having someone qualified telling me I wasn't crazy, and terror for realizing it might be too late to save my relationship with Jessica. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of household chores performed with one arm, making coffee, taking a shower with difficulty, trying to eat something despite the knot in my stomach that seemed to have permanently installed itself in my digestive system. Around 11 o'clock, Mike knocked on my door with a pot of soup his wife Carol had prepared, claiming that men alone need real food, not those frozen junk from the supermarket. He immediately noticed my sling and the dejected expression on my face, but had the delicacy not to ask direct questions, just offered his silent company while we heated the soup and ate at a table that seemed too big for two people lost in their own thoughts. It was Mike who finally broke the silence. "Walter, I know it's none of my business, but I raised 3 children, and I can tell you that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their own choices, even when it hurts us more than it hurts them." The consultation with Dr. Thompson that afternoon was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, forcing me to confront decades of parenting patterns I had developed with the best intentions, but which had created disastrous consequences. Her office smelled of lavender and had decoration in soft tones that should have been calming, but couldn't diminish the storm of emotions that devastated my interior like a Category 5 hurricane. "Mr. Johnson," she said after I told the whole story again, this time with more details about the years of emotional manipulation I had ignored, "your daughter has learned that violence and emotional blackmail are effective tools to get what she wants. As long as these strategies continue to work, she won't have motivation to change her behavior." Dr. Thompson explained to me the concept of tough love, the idea that sometimes we need to allow the people we love to face the natural consequences of their choices, even when this causes us intense emotional suffering. "You're not abandoning your daughter," she emphasized when she saw tears begin to run down my face. "You're offering her the opportunity to grow and become a responsible person, something she'll never achieve if she continues depending on external financial rescues." When I left the office 2 hours later, I felt as if I had undergone emotional surgery, sore, but with hope that healing was beginning. The prescription Dr. Thompson gave me wasn't for medications, but for actions. Don't answer Jessica's calls for at least 2 weeks. Don't give money under any circumstances, and participate in a support group for parents of adult children with emotional and financial dependency problems. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of my life, each day dragging like a year while I fought against all parental instincts that screamed at me to call Jessica and save her one more time. My phone rang 17 times in the first 3 days. Always the same unknown number I knew was her calling from payphones, friends' houses, or borrowed cell phones, trying every possible strategy to convince me to give in. I let all the calls go to the answering machine, and the messages that accumulated were like an emotional roller coaster that went from desperate pleas to angry cursing, then back to promises of change and declarations of filial love, in a sequence that revealed the depth of the psychological problems I had helped create over the years. "Dad, please," I'm sleeping in a friend's car. It's 2 degrees below zero. I promise I'll pay back every penny, said one message recorded at 3 in the morning on a Thursday. Walter Johnson, you're a monster. I hope you're proud of letting your own daughter starve on the street, said another, recorded just 2 hours later, her voice distilling such pure hatred that made me question if I really knew the person I had raised. The support group doctor. Thompson had recommended met every Tuesday in the basement of the Main Street Methodist Church, and initially I hesitated to attend because publicly admitting that my relationship with my daughter had reached this point seemed like a confession of complete failure as a father. But when I finally forced myself to go down those stairs and sit in a folding chair beside other emotionally destroyed parents, I discovered I wasn't alone in my pain. There was Mike from accounting, whose 32-year-old daughter had stolen $15,000 from his joint account to buy drugs, and Susan from the library, whose 26-year-old son had moved back home and spent his days playing video games while she worked to support him. The group facilitator was a woman named Patricia Williams, a former 60-year-old nurse whose own son had died of an overdose after years of heroin addiction she had inadvertently financed through constant loans and emergency help. The first thing you all need to understand, Patricia told us at my first meeting, is that you didn't cause your children's problems. You can't control them, and you can't cure them. The only thing you can do is stop enabling destructive behaviors and focus on your own emotional recovery. Her words were like cold water in the face, forcing me to confront the reality that my good intentions had become part of the problem instead of the solution. During the sessions, I learned about concepts like emotional triangulation, where Jessica used Margaret's memories to emotionally manipulate me, and affective blackmail, the strategy of threatening to cut contact to get what she wanted. Each revelation was painful but necessary, like pulling a bandage from a wound that needs air to heal. At the end of the second week, Jessica's calls had stopped completely, and the silence was somehow scarier than the desperate messages. At least when she was calling, I knew she was alive. Now, having no idea where she was or how she was surviving, consumed me with anxiety that gnawed at my soul like acid. Mike noticed my emotional deterioration and began appearing at my house every day in the late afternoon, always with a plausible excuse. Needed to borrow sugar, wanted to know if I had seen his cat, had a tool he thought I might need. In the third week, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Jennifer Martinez, a social worker from the Cuyahoga County Department of Human Services. Mr. Johnson, I'm calling about your daughter, Jessica Johnson, she said, and my heart stopped beating for a few seconds while my mind raced through all the terrible possibilities that could have led to this official call. Is she okay? I managed to ask, my voice coming out like a strangled whisper. Physically, she's fine, Mr. Johnson, but she sought our services requesting emergency housing assistance and food aid. During the screening interview, she mentioned she had had an argument with you and had been homeless for almost 3 weeks. Jennifer explained that Jessica was temporarily staying at a shelter for women in vulnerable situations, working part-time at a McDonald's, and trying to save enough money to rent a room in a boarding house. She specifically asked me not to contact you, Jennifer continued, but our protocol requires us to try to reconnect families when possible, especially in cases where there's no history of abuse or violence. The irony of the situation hit me like a slap in the face. Technically, there was a history of violence, but Jessica had been the aggressor, not the victim. How is she emotionally? I asked, trying to extract any information that could help me understand my daughter's mental state. She seems determined to manage on her own, Mr. Johnson. She said she's learned some hard lessons in recent weeks and is trying to grow up. Those were her words. When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of pride and deep sadness. Pride because maybe Jessica was finally learning responsibility, and sadness because it had taken so much suffering to get to this point. A month and a half after our last conversation, Jessica appeared at my door on a cold and grey Saturday morning. But the woman who stood before me was fundamentally different from the person who had attacked me in that living room. She had lost weight, which made her eyes seem bigger and more vulnerable, but there was something more solid in the way she held herself upright, a dignity I hadn't seen in her for years. She was wearing a clean McDonald's uniform under a winter coat that had clearly been bought at a thrift store, and carrying a small bag I imagined contained all her worldly possessions. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice coming out lower and less confident than I remembered, but without the toxic aggressiveness that had dominated our last interaction. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." I hesitated for a few seconds. Not out of anger, but out of fear. Fear that her presence might undo all the emotional progress I had made in recent weeks. Fear that I would give in again to the old behavioral patterns that had created this whole situation. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something that hadn't been there for years. Genuine humility, mixed with what seemed to be the beginning of true repentance. "Sure, come in," I replied, opening the door, but maintaining a physical distance she noticed immediately. The atmosphere in the room was charged with memories of our last encounter, and I could see Jessica looking at the exact spot where she had pushed me, her expression showing what seemed to be genuine shame for the first time in her adult life. She sat on the edge of the sofa, keeping her hands nervously interlaced in her lap, clearly struggling to find the right words to start a conversation we both knew would define the future of our relationship. "Dad, I came here to apologize," she began, and immediately I felt my defenses go up, because I had heard those words hundreds of times over the years, always followed by a new request for money. Not just for what I did that day, for pushing you and hurting you, but for all the years I manipulated you, emotionally blackmailed you, and turned you into my personal bank instead of treating you like my father. Her words caught me completely off guard because she was articulating behaviors she had never even admitted to recognizing, much less taking responsibility for. "Jessica," I began to speak, but she gently raised her hand, asking me to let her finish. "Please, Dad, I need to say all this before I lose courage. In the last 6 weeks, living in a shelter and working for $6.50 an hour, I finally understood what you were trying to teach me all these years. That money doesn't appear out of thin air, that every penny needs to be earned through work and sweat, and that adult responsibility means facing the consequences of your own choices instead of running to Daddy whenever life gets difficult." Her words were accompanied by tears she wasn't trying to hide, but they were different tears from the ones I had seen before. They weren't tears of manipulation or self-pity, but tears of genuine regret, mixed with what seemed to be relief at finally telling the truth. The smell coming from her was of cheap soap and fast food uniform, but there was a dignity in that aroma of honest work that was sweeter than any expensive perfume she had worn in the past. "I hurt you, Dad," she continued, her voice beginning to fail with emotion, "and there's no excuse in the world that justifies it. I physically attacked the man who raised me, loved me unconditionally, and always tried to do the best for me, just because he refused to give me money I didn't deserve and hadn't earned." Jessica stopped talking and covered her face with her hands, sobbing with an intensity that made my paternal heart want to run to her and hug her. But therapy and the support group had taught me that sometimes true love means maintaining emotional distance until you're sure the change is genuine, not just another manipulation strategy. "These 6 weeks were the worst and best of my life," she said, when she managed to control herself enough to continue speaking. "Worst, because I finally understood the extent of what I had become. A 28-year-old adult who had never really grown up because she always had a father who saved her from all consequences. Best, because for the first time in my life, I'm supporting myself, paying for my own food, my own housing, and discovering I'm capable of much more than I thought." She showed me an envelope with the first full paycheck she had received from McDonald's, $246 net for 40 hours of work. And the expression of genuine pride on her face was something I hadn't seen since she graduated from high school 10 years ago. "I didn't come here to ask for money, Dad," she said, anticipating the question I hadn't asked yet. "I came here to ask if there's any way we can rebuild our relationship, starting from scratch, based on mutual respect instead of financial dependence." For a few minutes we sat in silence, the weight of years of destructive patterns hanging in the air between us, like a toxic cloud that was finally beginning to dissipate. I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of manipulation or falsehood I had learned to recognize over the years, but all I saw was a young woman who seemed to have finally begun to grow emotionally after almost a decade of prolonged adolescence. "Jessica," I finally replied, choosing each word carefully, "I want to believe you've changed, but you need to understand it will take time to rebuild the trust that was broken, not just that day when you attacked me, but over years of broken promises and manipulative behavior." She nodded vigorously, her tears beginning to flow again, but they were still tears of relief, not self-pity. "I understand completely, Dad, and I don't expect you to trust me immediately. I'll have to prove through actions, not just words, that I've really changed." We talked for 2 more hours, establishing clear boundaries. She could come for dinner on Sundays if she wanted, but there would be no financial help for at least 6 months. She could call me once a week to talk, but any request for money would result in contact being cut immediately. And most importantly, she agreed to continue individual therapy to work on the underlying problems that had led to years of destructive behavior. When she got up to leave, she hesitantly asked if she could hug me, and for the first time in years, the hug we shared was free from the underlying tension of hidden agendas or financial manipulations. The months that followed were like watching a metamorphosis in slow motion, seeing my daughter gradually transform from a dysfunctional adult child into a responsible young woman I barely recognize sometimes. Jessica strictly maintained all the agreements we had established. She called every Wednesday at 7 at night for conversations that lasted exactly 30 minutes, showed up for dinner every Sunday at 5 o'clock sharp, bringing a cheap dessert she had bought with her own money, and didn't mention financial issues even once in 3 months. Through these carefully structured conversations, I discovered aspects of her personality that had been obscured by years of financial drama and emotional manipulation. She was naturally funny when she wasn't desperate, had interesting opinions about books she was reading at the public library to save money, and showed genuine empathy for other women at the shelter that was beginning to remind me of the natural compassion Margaret had always shown for people in difficulty. In the 4th month, she told me she had been promoted to shift supervisor at McDonald's, an increase of only 50 cents an hour, but she talked about it with the same pride someone might talk about an executive promotion at a large corporation. "Dad, I never knew working could make me feel so good about myself," she said during one of our Sunday dinners, her eyes shining with a vitality I hadn't seen in years. "When I get my paycheck and know I earned every penny honestly, it's a better feeling than anything I ever bought with borrowed money." Dr. Thompson had warned me to watch for signs that the change was genuine versus performative, and everything I observed in Jessica indicated an authentic transformation that was happening at the fundamental level of her character. The real proof of her change came in the 5th month, when Jessica called on a Tuesday, outside the usual schedule, with a tense voice that immediately put me on high alert. "Dad, I need to tell you something," she said, and my stomach immediately contracted, preparing to hear that she had lost her job or needed borrowed money once again. "Remember I told you about Amanda, my roommate at the shelter? She's going through a crisis, lost her job yesterday, and begged me to lend her $200 to pay rent." My first reaction was pride. Jessica had saved $200, more money than she had ever saved in her adult life. followed immediately by concern that she was about to repeat the same destructive patterns we had finally broken. "I said no, Dad," she continued, and I almost dropped the phone in surprise. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I know exactly how she's feeling, desperate, scared, willing to do anything to solve the immediate problem. But I finally understood that giving her money won't solve the fundamental problems that led to the situation, the same way you giving me money never solved my fundamental problems. Her voice was loaded with emotion, but it was the emotion of someone who had made a difficult but correct decision, not someone asking for validation for a questionable choice. Instead, I offered to help Amanda review her resume, practice job interviews, and accompany her in looking for work. Emotional and practical support instead of a financial rescue that will only postpone confronting the real problems. When I hung up the phone that night, I cried for the first time in months, but they were tears of paternal pride mixed with deep relief that my daughter had really learned life's most important lesson about adult responsibility. In the 6th month, Jessica did something that caught me completely off guard. She showed up at my Sunday dinner with a small envelope and a nervous expression that reminded me of the shy child she had been before rebellious adolescence. "Dad, I know you said not to talk about money, but this is different," she said, extending the envelope toward me with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were $50 in 5s and 10s, clearly money that had been saved penny by penny over weeks or months. "It's the first payment on my debt," she explained, her words coming out in a nervous rush as if she were afraid I would reject the gesture. "I calculated that I owe approximately $15,000 to you in loans never repaid over the years, and I intend to pay it all back, even if it takes 10 years. The emotion I felt at that moment was indescribable, not because of the ridiculously small amount of money, but because of what that gesture represented. For the first time in her adult life, Jessica was taking responsibility for the financial consequences of her past choices. "Jessica, you don't need to," I began to say, but she gently interrupted me. "Yes, Dad, I do. Not for you, but for me. I need to prove to myself that I'm capable of honoring my obligations and cleaning up the messes I created in the past." I kept those $50 in a special drawer of my desk, not because I needed the money, but because they represented the first concrete evidence that my daughter had really grown up and become a person I could be proud of again. That night, I called Dr. Thompson, and for the first time in months, we had a conversation about progress instead of problems, about hope instead of despair, about a daughter who had finally learned the difference between true love and toxic dependence. A year after that terrible day when Jessica pushed me and broke my shoulder along with my heart, we were sitting in the same living room where it all began. But now, she was helping me decorate a Christmas tree we had bought together with money she had insisted on splitting 50-50. My shoulder had healed completely, both physically and emotionally, and Jessica had moved to a small but clean apartment she shared with a responsible co-worker, paying half of the $600 rent with the salary she earned as assistant manager at the McDonald's, where she had now worked for 8 months. She had lost 20 pounds, not from stress or poor eating, but from an active and healthy lifestyle that included walking to work every day and cooking simple meals instead of constantly eating fast food. And the physical transformation reflected an inner change that was even more impressive. During our weekly Sunday dinners, which we had expanded to include some activities together, watching old movies, taking walks in the park, visiting the local farmers market, we discovered we actually enjoyed each other's company when we removed the toxic element of financial dependence that had poisoned our relationship for so many years. "Dad," she said while hanging an ornament she had made for me in a craft class at the library, "I want you to know these have been the best 12 months of my life, even though they were also the most difficult." Her voice carried a maturity and emotional depth I had never heard before, and when she looked me in the eyes, I saw an adult woman who had found her own identity instead of the perpetual child who had dominated our relationship for so long. "Jessica," I replied, adjusting a golden bow on a nearby branch, "you can't imagine the pride I feel seeing the strong and independent woman you've become. It's exactly what your mother would have expected from you." The mention of Margaret no longer brought the sharp pain that used to accompany her memories, but a comforting warmth of gratitude for having had a partner who helped me raise a daughter who, despite all the detours and problems, had finally found her way in life. Jessica had started individual therapy 6 months ago with a young psychologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, and the progress she made each week was visible not only in her behavior, but in the way she talked about herself and our relationship. "Dr. Chen helped me understand that I was using you as an emotional crutch," Jessica told me during one of our walks in the park. "And that part of my anger came from the fact that I knew deep down that I was wasting my life, but it was easier to blame you for spoiling me than to take responsibility for my own choices." The brutal honesty with which she analyzed her own behavioral patterns was sometimes painful to hear, but also deeply healing, as if each confession removed another layer of the emotional infection that had contaminated our family for so long. In the 8th month of our reconciliation, she had saved $1,200, exactly the amount she had asked me for on that fateful day, and used the money to enroll in night accounting classes at the local community college. "I want to learn to handle money the right way," she explained when she showed me the textbooks she had bought used. "I want to understand budgets, investments, financial planning, all the things I should have learned at 20 instead of 29. Seeing my daughter study at the kitchen table every night after work, asking intelligent questions about financial concepts during our Sunday dinners, was like watching a miracle in slow motion. The transformation of someone who had been financially irresponsible her entire life into a young adult who was genuinely interested in building a stable and sustainable future. But it was on the eve of the first anniversary of our incident, as we had begun to call it, that Jessica did something that definitively sealed my confidence in the permanence of her change. She arrived for our Sunday dinner carrying not just the usual dessert, this time a chocolate cake she had learned to make in a cooking class, offered free by the library, but also a folder of documents she carefully placed on the dining table. "Dad, I want to show you something," she said, opening the folder to reveal meticulously organized spreadsheets, bank statements, and a 5-year financial plan written by hand in her careful handwriting. In the last 3 months, with Dr. Chen's help and a free financial counselor from the community college, I created a complete plan for my financial life. The spreadsheet showed every penny she earned and spent, categorized by basic necessities, emergency savings, moderate fun, and monthly payments on the debt she had calculated she owed me. "According to this plan," she explained, her finger running through the numbers with the pride of someone who had finally learned to master something that used to dominate her, "I'll be able to completely pay off my debt to you in 4 years and 7 months, while simultaneously building a $5,000 emergency fund and saving to eventually make a down payment on a small house." The level of detail and realism in her plan was impressive, but even more impressive was the genuine passion with which she talked about budgets and financial goals. Concepts that used to cause her anxiety were now a source of excitement and sense of control over her own destiny. "Jessica," I said, studying every page of her plan, "you have no idea how proud I am not just of the numbers here, but of the mature and responsible person who created them." The most powerful moment of that evening came when Jessica closed the document folder and looked at me with an expression that mixed gratitude, regret, and determination in equal proportions. "Dad, I know I can never completely undo the damage I caused to our relationship, especially that day when I physically hurt you," she said, her voice beginning to fail with emotion, but remaining firm in its purpose. "But I want you to know that was the most important day of my life, not because I'm proud of what I did, but because it was when you finally loved me enough to say no, to force me to face the consequences of my choices instead of rescuing me one more time." Her words hit me like a revelation, because she had articulated something I had struggled to understand throughout our healing process. That sometimes the greatest act of paternal love is allowing our children to fail and learn from their own mistakes, even when it causes us deep emotional suffering. "When you told me to get out of the house that day," she continued, "it was the first time in my adult life that someone loved me enough to let me grow, instead of keeping me in perpetual childhood through constant rescues." She extended her hand across the table and held mine with a firmness that conveyed not dependence, but genuine connection between two adults who respected each other mutually. "Thank you for saving me from myself, Dad, even when it meant letting me go." At that moment, looking into the eyes of the strong and independent woman my daughter had become, I knew we had not only survived our most devastating family crisis, but emerged from it as better people with a healthier relationship than we had ever had before. When Jessica left that night, after helping me wash the dishes and organize the kitchen, small gestures of reciprocity that had become natural over the months, I sat in my favorite armchair thinking about the extraordinary journey we had completed together. The man who had been pushed and wounded by his own daughter a year before had learned that true love sometimes requires us to make painful choices that benefit the loved one in the long term, even when they cause immediate suffering to everyone involved. The woman who had attacked me in that living room had discovered that independence and personal responsibility weren't punishments, but gifts that allowed her to transform into the person she always had the potential to be. Our relationship was now built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, healthy boundaries, and love that didn't depend on financial transactions or emotional manipulation to express itself. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt our family was truly healed and complete, not despite the crisis we had faced, but because of it, because it was through suffering and temporary separation that we finally learned how to love each other in a healthy and sustainable way. And when I closed my eyes that night, for the first time in years, I didn't worry about what tomorrow might bring, because I knew that both Jessica and I had developed the emotional tools necessary to face any future challenge with dignity, honesty, and true love. Walter and Jessica's story forces us to question our own beliefs about family love, responsibility, and the limits of what we should do for those we love. How many times do we confuse help with enabling destructive behaviors? When does our love become a prison that prevents the growth of those we want to protect? Walter discovered that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their choices, even when it causes us deep pain. Jessica learned that dignity comes from independence earned through honest work, not from financial rescues that perpetuate emotional dependence. This story reminds us that healthy family relationships require clear boundaries, mutual respect, and the courage to say no when necessary. Sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to grow through adversity, instead of protecting them from all of life's difficulties. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories that explore the moral and emotional dilemmas of family life. And you, have you ever had to make difficult decisions about helping family members? How do you find the balance between love and responsibility? Share your experience in the comments.